See you this morning. I like it when you hear everybody laughing and kind of it seems like the ice breaks when everybody shakes hands and stuff. And as we get started this morning, last week we talked about the temptation of Jesus, and it was just kind of an example of all the things that we go through and all the temptations that Satan entices us with every day. And we're seeing that of especially more and more about people giving in to those temptations. And it's the title of my sermon this morning is the instruction of Jesus. And we said many times that I don't think this world is getting more evil. I think it's always been that way. It just seems like where we live now is becoming more evil. And we've kind of been in this area in the Bible Belt where we were blessed by good Christian people, good moral people, and man, that's not popular anymore. Actually, Christians are being persecuted in America even today. And so this morning I want to speak about the instruction of Jesus and kind of ask you, I always try to start my sermons with some questions, kind of make you think a little bit. But have you ever had to learn the same lesson twice, if not more? We didn't learn the first time. We kind of had to go a round or two, right? I mean, we all have done that. We've done that. Probably say I don't want to admit to that in a sense that I'm kind of maybe a little hard-headed, maybe a slow learner in some ways, right? Sometimes the lesson didn't soak in. As kids, have you ever thought about? I knew kids that when we was little, when you got in trouble, you got spanked, and some of those kids just thought, that trouble was worth the spanking and it don't hurt very long. That's kind of the wrong way to think, right? My neighbor, Cecil Caldwell, he was talking, he used to raise hogs, and he usually just had electric fence. And he said he had one sow that she would get about 10 to 15 feet from that electric fence, and she'd start squealing. He said as loud as she could squeal, and then she would run through that electric fence. She knew it was going to hurt before she ever started that direction, but she decided it was worth it to get that shock. Well, it's never worth it. And but the thing I think that we struggle with the most is it's hard for us to rely or trust others. For whatever reason in our life, relationships, things like that, it's hard for us to rely or trust other people because people have let us down, right? That's a fact. Everyone in this room, somebody's let you down at some point in time. And but we need to look at it differently when we approach Jesus, because Jesus will never let you down, ever. Jesus paid the ultimate sacrifice on the cross. At any point in his life and his ministry on this earth, he could have said, no, they're not worth it, and just vanished to heaven. Went back to paradise. But we need to realize that we can believe in him, we can trust in him, and it's okay to give him control of your life because he loves us. In Deuteronomy 31:6, it says, be strong and of good courage, fear not, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord thy God, he it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. And as you read this verse, it's kind of want to always break this down. Katie was critiquing me a while ago. She goes, I seen that you put in Luke 5:1-3, Luke 5:4-7, Luke 8-11. She goes, why didn't you say 1-11? It'd be a lot easier. Then Brandy, she did. Sometimes we need to break these things down and we look at them instead of just reading them and say, okay, I read a Bible verse. Because in Deuteronomy 31:6, it tells us right at the beginning, it says, be strong and of good courage. That means we got to stand up and we got to stand for something. On Wednesday night, we talked about that. What do you believe in? You have to believe in something. And when we believe in God, we can be strong. and we can be courageous. And why is it important for us to be strong and courageous? Because the next few words here it says, fear not. And I'm going to put it in a little bit different way. Fear not and do not be afraid of the enemy. Fear not and do not be afraid of the enemy, because God will never leave you. See, as Christians, that's a gift that we can have in our life, is that we can fear not and not be afraid of the things of this world, because we have a God that will never leave us nor forsake us. The thing about it is we got to choose that. We got to say, that's the path I'm going down, and I'm not looking back. See, when we start the path to righteousness, when we start the path to godliness and following Jesus, Satan's right there showing us all the things we could be doing that we used to do. And then he lies to us and tells us how much fun we were having doing it. Most of our testimonies are proof that the consequences of our old life wasn't worth it. Be strong and courageous. You know, I think in the last couple of years, especially with the pandemic and all this, fear has been something that has overwhelmed people. Now, I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but you know, there was actually people that never left their house for a year. Had things delivered to them. Fear set in where they just locked themselves in a house and did not leave. What I'm going to talk about this morning is about Jesus and the miracle of the fishes. And actually, this is the beginning of him calling his disciples to follow him and become disciples and to become fishers of men. Okay? And it was a process that you think about Peter and James and John and those guys. When Jesus walked up to them and said, hey, would you want to be my disciples? They didn't say, yep, and just took off and followed him. There was a few things that took place, and they didn't follow him immediately. They had to think about it, and there were some things they did wrong. But in this case here, I'm going to be in Luke, and then I'm going to go to John, and it's going to give two different portions of the story. But I want to start in Luke 5, 1 through 3. And says, and it came to pass as the people pressed upon him to hear the word of God, he stood by the lake of Gennesaret, which is the Sea of Galilee, and saw two ships standing by the lake. But the fishermen were gone out of them, and were washing their nets. And he entered into one of the ships, which was Simon's, and prayed him that he would thrust out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the people out of the ship. So he walks up here, and there's these two ships at the edge of the water, and the crowd is so big, and they're pushing on him, that Jesus asked the soon-to-be disciples, Simon Peter, he says, push your boat out a little bit. So he pushed his boat out a bit, and that was his pulpit. That's where he preached from, okay? That's where he started teaching the people. He was standing in that boat, and he was teaching the people so he could kind of have a little room instead of the people crowding around him and kind of pushing up on him. And as we're going to go on to 4 through 7, when he had left speaking, when he had got done teaching them, he said unto Simon, launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a draught, or for a catch. And Simon answered unto him, Master, we have toiled all the night and have taken nothing. Nevertheless, at thy word, I will let down the net. Here's how Peter answered him. He says, we've been fishing all night and they're not biting. That's what I do for a living. I'm a professional fisherman, and they haven't bought all night. But I guess I'll do what you say, and we'll go do it. Have you ever just done something Jesus wants you to do, not because you wanted to, just to make him happy? Maybe sometimes we came to church just to make our mom happy, or someone we live with, a family member, that we didn't actually do it because that's what was right and we was following the instruction of Jesus. We just did it to say, okay, maybe you'll quit asking me. How many of you went to a men's encounter or did something, or some men's retreat or women's retreat so they quit asking you? A lot of times in our life, it's not because we want to, we just appease them for a little bit. In verse 6 it says, And when they had this done, they enclosed a great multitude of fishes, and their net brake. It's amazing how when they went out and they did what Jesus asked them to do, that they had so many fish that the net broke. So often in our life, Jesus is trying to give us instructions to bless us, to help us out. And we don't want to do it. Or we only do it half-heartedly just to appease somebody. And the thing about it is when we hold back, when we do those things, we're not receiving the blessings that God intended for us. We're not receiving the protection and the comfort and the strength to be strong and courageous. They didn't say they went out there for hours and they did this. You know, when we say yes to Jesus, Jesus can start working in our life immediately. I want you to hold tight to that section right there that says, and their nets broke. Because in John, I'm going to give you another story about almost the same, that the nets didn't break. And I want to explain that in a minute. But in verse 7, and they beckoned unto their partners which were in the other ship, that they should come and help them. And they came and filled both the ships, so that they began to sink. Their nets weren't only full, they filled the boats so full that they wasn't sure the boats were going to make it back. See, the biggest sin, the greatest temptation that Satan ever will speak to you in your life is God is not enough. God cannot provide your needs. He sure won't provide your wants, and you won't be happy. That's what Satan tempts us with. And then he shows us all these things of this world, that if we'll partake in those things, if we'll go this path, there's where true happiness is. And here's an example of the disciples were professional fishermen. And Jesus just said, won't we go out and try one more time? And I think grudgingly, they may have been talking under their breath a little bit as they took the boat out and as they took the nets out, going, I can't believe this dude's wanting me to do this. What's he know about fishing? Think about that. Whatever profession you're in, if somebody wanted to give you advice on how do you do your job, how well would we take that? None of us take that very well, do we? Especially someone that you think that don't do your job, has never done your job. They called in another boat and they filled both boats. They filled both ships. I want to go on to Luke, and we're going to go to 8 through 11. But it says, and when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. So I think when you see this part in this section, Jesus is just speaking to him. It has nothing to do with the fish they just caught. See, just previously, before this moment, Jesus had asked Peter and his brother and John and then James to be disciples, and they went back to fishing. Jesus called them to do something special. And it scared them. They weren't sure of it. So they went back to what they knew, and they went back to fishing. Well, Jesus didn't give up on them. He went to where they were, got in their boat, and showed them that he could fish better than they could. See, the thing about it, I'm going to go ahead and keep reading. I'm going to get ahead of myself. It says, For he was astonished, and all that were with him, at the draught, or the catch of the fishes which they had taken. And so was also James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were partners with Simon. And Jesus said unto Simon, Fear not, from henceforth thou shalt catch men. See, Jesus doesn't give up on us. He just keeps giving us opportunities. He keeps giving us, if you will, lessons to learn, to realize he's the one that you can trust in. This was a physical example of catching the fish, providing for them. In verse 11, as we finish this section, it says, And when they had brought their ships to land, they forsook all and followed him. What was so important about this parable, or if you want to say of the miracle of the fishes in this section, what they realized they could trust Jesus with everything. Jesus had control. Those men had fished all their life, and they knew where the good fishing spots were. But they couldn't control whether they could catch fish or not. Jesus had control of everything. And they understood that. They realized that. And you know, in our life, there has to come a point when we realize that Jesus is what's best for us. Not the world. The world doesn't care about you in any way, shape, or form. Something you're going to hear a lot about, I think, in the days to come is one world. A one world order. One world government. And that government can take care of all your needs. It's coming. If you listen to a lot of the overseas news and stuff, they're demanding it. Ronald Reagan put it this way. He goes, you know, the scariest thing in the world is to hear your government say, trust me, I'll take care of you. I'm not anti-government, but the point I'm trying to make here is when we replace our trust in Jesus for a man or a government or a world system, we're wrong. God says, do not put any other gods before you. We're supposed to trust in the God of heaven, not any man that claims they're God on earth. We need to see that. We need to know that and know the goodness of God and listen to the lessons He's teaching us. As a Christian, we talk about a lot on Wednesday nights is our religion. You can go buy a Bible and read it yourself and ask God to give you discernment. You don't have to listen to me and me try to explain it to you and not allow you to read God's Word. God wants you to know His Word. He wants you to know His direction. He wants you to be able to get through the lessons of life and learn something from it. Man, I've had a lot of lessons in life, and some of them I didn't learn much, and I had to go through it again. We need to let Jesus take care of us. I'm going to kind of read a few things here. Peter had went back to what he knew. He'd went back to fishing. Peter realized he was a poor fisherman compared to Jesus. And when Jesus gives a commandment, we don't need to argue with Him. When Jesus asks us to do something, why do we argue? Most of us in this room have kids, grandkids. What happens when you ask them to do something? They argue. You know, you go from, I don't know what happens. I think it's the old world. You got this sweet little baby that just grins and does anything you ask. And as they grow up a little bit, they get smarter than you. And they question everything that you do. Well, you know what? We can talk about our kids all we want, but as adults, we're that mouthy little kid to God that we question everything He wants us to do. So we think about when we get so aggravated at those kids, we're that kid that God's dealing with on a daily basis. That throw temper tantrums, that talk back. And God says, if you just do what I'd ask you to do, life would be so much better. Right? Here's one more thing I want you to think about. Jesus never gives an impossible commandment. Jesus will never ask you to do anything that is impossible. The Bible even speaks of that. Right? Excuse me. In Psalms 32:8, it says, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the ways which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. God doesn't ask us to do something and sit back to see and watch us fall. He said, I will instruct thee, I will teach thee, and I will be with you all the way through your life. If you'll allow me to be a part of your life, I will never leave you, and I never will forsake you. And I will give you all the wisdom, I'll give you all the strength, and I'll give you all the courage to whatever you're going through in life to get through it. Man, what else? Where are we ever going to get an offer like that? That's true. We get lots of offers. We get a lot of suggestions, right? But most, they're not true. They're going to fall apart. They're not going to last. So the disciples, this is a moment in the disciples' life. The two boats are full of fish, and they fell on their knees and they've confessed that Jesus is the Son of God, and we'll go anywhere you want us to go. Anywhere you want us to go. And they went on a tremendous journey, if you will. They watched Jesus heal people. They watched Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead. They did all these things, and they seen these amazing that had never happened before. And there was something about it that they didn't quite understand, is Jesus told them the entire time that he was going to be the sacrifice for sin. Okay? The lesson that we're learning in life is Jesus said in the moment of the disciples, I'm going to have to give my life for you to be free. Okay? So when Jesus was nailed to the cross and died and buried, it shook the disciples to the core. See, the lesson that he'd been teaching them for so long, they hadn't totally got the whole story and realized that. Because Jesus told them, basically, he told them exactly what was going to happen. He said, I'm going to die for your sins. I'm going to be buried. In 3 days, I'm coming back. And I understand that the rationale of that is, we know when someone is buried, they don't come back. And you know, to help with them to think of their thinking, they didn't get that lesson, okay? So they're gone. They go back to fishing. Jesus is buried, and it just broke their hearts, and they just went back to what they knew. Kind of the same story, right? Jesus had called them in Luke to be disciples, and they went to fishing because that was just what they knew how to do. So Peter said, I'm going fishing. So they got a boat and they went fishing. So we're going to start in John chapter 21 and verse 1. It says, after these things Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and on this wise showed he himself. Jesus had been crucified and buried. And all of a sudden, Jesus shows up on the beach where kind of sound like the same story. And there were together Simon Peter and Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other of his disciples. And Simon Peter said unto them, I go a-fishing. And they say unto him, we also go with thee. And they went forth and entered into a ship, and immediately, and that night they caught nothing. But when the morning was now come, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples knew not that it was Jesus. Verse 5, then Jesus said unto them, children, have you any meat? And they answered him, no. And he said unto them, cast the net on the right side of the ship, and you shall find. I want you to think about this. You think that might have been a little deja vu for them? Thinking, man, we've heard somebody tell us this before. They cast therefore, and now they were not able to draw it for the multitudes of fishes. In verse 7 it says, therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved saith unto Peter, this is John, it is the Lord. And now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he girt his fisher coat unto him, for he was naked, and did not cast himself into the sea, and did cast himself into the sea. And he wasn't naked in those days. Naked today is a lot different than naked in those days. Okay, he just had an undergarment on and stuff. But anyway, he jumped in the sea. And the other disciples came in a little ship, for they were not far from land, but as it were 200 cubits, dragging the net with fishes. And as soon then as they were come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid thereon, and bread. And Jesus said unto them, Bring of the fish which ye have now caught. Jesus had breakfast cooked for them. The fish that they caught, the net didn't break. It was full. The difference between the story in Luke and the difference between the story in John is Jesus had completed his ministry. He had died on the cross. He had been buried and rose again the third day. That's the picture that sin had a hold of people, and there never had been a payment for sin. But now that Jesus had completed the mission, the nets didn't break. And he wanted them to be fishers of men. And once you become a child of God, no one can take you away from God. See, it's an important story that we see this, and know that once we're the child of God, he will never leave us. He will never forsake us. We can be strong. We can be courageous. And we can be not afraid of the enemy. In verse 12 it says, Jesus saith unto them, Come and dine. And none of the disciples durst ask him, Who art thou? Knowing that it was the Lord. And Jesus then cometh and taketh bread and giveth them, and fish likewise. This is now the third time that Jesus showed himself to his disciples. After that, he was risen from the dead. I want to read a commentary here in J. Vernon McGee. It says, Fishing must be done according to his direction. There are many lessons for us here. Fishing is an art. You must go where the fish are, and you must use the right kind of bait. You must be patient. But the important lesson he is teaching us is that we must fish according to his instructions. If we are ever going to win men for him, we must fish according to his instructions. In this instance, the net broke, and this is in Luke. But later on in the Gospel of John, a net overloaded with fish does not break. The fisherman's net illustrates a truth. At this point, there is no net that can hold the fish for the simple reason that he has not yet died and risen from the dead. That is the gospel. The net which will hold fish must be one that rests upon the death and resurrection of Christ. At this time there has been no death and resurrection. The net broke. After his death and resurrection, he told them how to fish, and the net did not break. Here he tells them to go out and preach the gospel to the very ends of the earth. I want you to think about this lesson today. We think about for the disciples. This is a couple different times they had the same lesson. I think this encourages you and me that we're going to fail in life. There's time we're not going to get the lesson, but Jesus keeps teaching it. And we need to understand that we need to be seeking God's guidance for our life to live life correctly. That's why we struggle. That's why we fail, is because we don't allow God to instruct us and follow his instructions. We've all done it. We buy stuff at the store and we don't read the instructions till we get about halfway through building something and we can't put it together. That's kind of what we do with life, isn't it? We've went through a good part of our life not listening to the instructions, and the sad part is we got to go back and tear some of it apart and rebuild it. I want to go now to 2 Timothy chapter 2:26. It says, And that they may recover themselves out of the snares of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. Something else that you need to know and need to realize is Jesus isn't the only one fishing. Satan is fishing for you too. He's kind of like snagging. He's throwing big old treble hooks out in the water to see if he can hook you. See, when we look at the life that way and we understand the seriousness of that, and we go back to Deuteronomy and it says, do not fear or be afraid of the enemy, he's speaking of Satan. Sometimes he uses people to be those enemies, but Satan is using those people. We need to understand Jesus isn't the only one fishing. It was important for the disciples to have a refresher course from Jesus, to teach them, to show them, to prove himself to them, to come to their senses. See, the thing about it is in our life, there has to be a point that we come to our senses and realize that we need Jesus and that he's the answer. Nothing else in this world will work. You think about all the remedies that are offered to you today to get through life. 99% of them just numb you. They don't cure anything. I'm probably getting in trouble here on the internet or whatever, but you know the new marijuana, the THC and all this, that's a new miracle cure. That's not curing any disease. That just numbs the pain. Jesus is the cure. And there's no side effects. No, there is side effects. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, all of those kind of things. They're good side effects. You think about all the things that this world has to offer, you know the side effects there. Right? Satan wants you to be confused and not thinking clearly, so he can continue to control you. I want you to think about that. You go back to I'm going to go back to this one world system and all these things that's going on in there, and they're providing you with all these things. Do you know why? So they can control you easier. To make you depend upon them so that you do whatever they want. Satan makes you think. Satan makes you confused so you don't think clearly, so he can confuse you. Why do you think it's so important that Jesus taught time after time how we could be set free? How we could be set free. I want to flip over to John chapter 8:32 as we get ready to close. And it says, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Jesus has always spoke truth. Most of the time we don't want to hear it because it hurts. But if we'll accept the truth, we'll accept the lesson and learn from the lessons that are being taught to us on a daily basis, we can be set free. So the instructions of Jesus are to set us free from the control that the world and Satan has upon us. I want you to think about that, so that we can be strong and courageous without fear and know who our enemy is. We're going to take a moment of invitation if the Lord has spoken to your heart in any way. Maybe we need to pray that we'll just listen to the lessons Jesus is teaching us, that the instruction that he's trying to give us, that we'll listen and we'll say, yes, I'll follow you. You think about the disciples when they finally said yes and what they got to experience. They'd seen things they'd never seen before. They'd seen miracles. They'd seen people healed. It was amazing. I promise you, if you say yes to Jesus, you're not going to miss out on life. Life will just be beginning.